So next one is from David. We're going to get into something that is less bound in terms of the actual turning the pedals and performance, but still perhaps even greater determinant of the performance. What's that, Nate?
There's
Nate's very
twice
excited.
as many notes on this one as the last one.
We're hitting you with 2 deep dives. And then after that, we're getting into full on. It's just going to be short ones thereafter. So, and hopefully we'll finish it off with a normal one, but lots of rapid fire. So, but this one has an application to all of us in various aspects. Unlike cadence, this transcends cycling and really athletic endurance or performance period. So David says, hey, TrainerRoad, I listen to all the podcasts and really enjoy them. There's always some relevant takeaways, even if it's a discipline I don't do. So I do a lot of training plans and just roll them in back to back. I get up at around 5 a.m., have a cup of tea, and he says cuppa, and he says he is Scottish. So that's me reading it as such. I will not try to imitate the accent at all. And he says, and I hit the trainer around 5:30 in the morning. I hit my numbers, and then on Monday, Wednesday, Friday, I run 10K on a treadmill. All my training is fasted. He says, like my Lord and mentor, Chad. Man, David, Chad experimented with that stuff a long time ago. He doesn't do that anymore. So, and then he also says, I'll bow when I say his name, which I think is funny there. So,
Amen, David.
He says, I do the mid-volume plans. I ride outside when I can, but as I'm currently waiting on surgery for a grade 3 AC separation, which likely is shoulder there. He says, I stick to indoor riding. Plus, I prefer training with specific goals. I'm not much of a social rider or person.
Oh, man, David.
Chad's just going to book a flight right now. You two are going to get along great. So solid training, good diet, and a bucket load of determination. And the only thing I don't do is race. I don't have any race goals. And you might ask why. And the answer is fear. In a workout session, I can hit my numbers. I can suffer and get through. When I have done races, the few races that he has done, the nerves and tension just ruin my headspace. Legs feel like a combination of lead and jelly, and all that training and focus just seems to disappear into thin air. Do you have any recommendations on how I should approach 2021? I'm determined to get some TTs and road races in. Thanks for any help you can give, David. So really, in the end, this question, you could phrase it in plenty of different ways, but probably one of the more direct ways is how to avoid choking, right? Because he said he has this fear that comes out. He can perform. He knows he can perform in training, but then game time is a very different experience. Like Amber, I don't think anybody really has much to add on this in relation to you, because having been a professional athlete and then swimming at a collegiate level and everything else, you've been on a lot of big stages. And so you probably have a lot of experience with this.
Yeah. And I really, we are going to spend some time on this, just warning you all right now. And the reason for that is that choking has a lot to do with risk and uncertainty. And this has applications far broader than just bike racing. And I'll use bike racing, to explain some of these concepts. But as you'll see, there's a lot of application for this in different facets of our life. And let's be honest, risk and uncertainty, like this is the theme of 2020. So it's pretty apropos to probably what most of us are dealing with right now. And yeah, I've worked with sports psychologists all through my career. So this is definitely something that I've personally struggled with. I know a lot of other people struggle with this too. I've learned a lot on this, not only for myself, but through seeing other athletes also at a high level struggling with this and finding solutions. So I really want to walk through this so that everybody understands why this happens, how it works, and then offer some tools for what you can actually do to avoid this scenario. So to start off, let's just define choking, right? So choking is a technical kind of psychological term that refers not just to sport, but kind of any type of performance. It could be a musical performance. It could be standing up and doing public speaking, but it's a seemingly inexplicable drop in performance when performing in a high pressure situation. So something that you normally, under normal circumstances, you could do in your sleep, no problem, but you add a little bit of pressure or, in a scenario, and suddenly you just kind of crumble under the pressure.
One thing that I want to point out with this too, Amber, is that a lot of the time choking is only referred to in the context of when you have other people applying that pressure on yourself, whether that's an audience or something else like that. But something for us to keep in mind, it also applies when we are the ones, just us, putting the pressure on ourselves as well, right?
Totally. like for a ramp test.
Yes, right. Then that's what I'm thinking of exactly. Somebody's listening to this and being like, whenever I take a FTP assessment, that's when I just can't seem to perform like that. That's a big question that somebody may have with this. So if you're hearing this, don't think that it's just on race day when other people are watching. It could also just be your own sourced pressure that you have.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. So you could be doing a ramp test by yourself in your basement, which is how I do mine. And yeah, pile on the pressure and suddenly everything changes. So how do we avoid this? Well, the way, in order to avoid it, we need to understand how it happens and why it happens. And there's a lot of different theories on this, but most of them come down to threat, the presence of threat. And that's going to sound a little bit weird right now, but I'm going to explain what I mean. And all of this has to do with your autonomic nervous system. And I'm going to drill down on that a lot because understanding how your autonomic nervous system works will help you work with your autonomic system in order to avoid choking. So I'm going to use a quick example here. Imagine that I've got a 10-foot piece of 2x4, a piece of wood, 4 inches by 2 inches. You put it on the ground flat, and I want you to walk across that 10 feet of 2x4. It's no problem, right? You could practically do it with your eyes closed. Now put that exact same 2x4 across a ravine with crocodiles at the bottom of it. It's suddenly very different, right?
Yeah.
Like you probably right now, if you close your eyes and imagine walking across a 2x4 on the ground, no problem. Now close your eyes and imagine walking across a 2x4 across a really deep ravine with crocodiles at the bottom. You probably there's a physical change in your body, right? Like a little sensation. Yeah, Jonathan.
A really good example of this is when you ride your road bike on the road, you can ride either on that white line or right next to that white line for hours on end. But then you get onto a single track and it's bench cut and you're like, I'm going to fly off this thing at any second and death is awaiting. Right. Or for me, I experienced this if I like ride in Whistler, or Canada loves to have skinnies all over the place. And they're not really that skinny in most cases. A lot of them are as wide or wider than the single tracks that I ride all the time. It does not matter. When I'm in that scenario, I am panicked because I feel like I'm going to drop off, even if it's just like a 6-inch drop off, which is amazing how it has that profound effect on us, even though we should know that we are capable of doing the task at hand.
Well, and that's the crux, right? You can walk across that 2x4, no problem. But all of a sudden, all of that training, all of that skill, it just goes out the window because now there's a threat. And that's the difference between the training and the racing. Like you said, the difference between riding that white line or riding a bench cut. The 2x4 on the ground, that's training. The 2x4 across the ravine with crocodiles, suddenly there's some other elements there that make it seem to make it more difficult. And that's kind of the race scenario. And the difference between these two situations, the reason the second one is so much more difficult than the first is because of our autonomic nervous system. So the autonomic nervous system, it does a lot of really great things. It is responsible for keeping you alive. It makes sure your heart is beating and you're breathing, even though you're not consciously deciding to inhale and exhale every time you need to, or to contract and relax your heart muscle every second that you need a heartbeat. Our autonomic nervous system is amazing. And two parts of that autonomic nervous system that we talk about a lot are the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system. So sympathetic is your fight or flight, and your parasympathetic is your rest and digest. Those two pieces are part of the autonomic nervous system. But for the purposes of this conversation, I'm going to refer mostly to the autonomic nervous system, and I might just abbreviate it and call it ANS for short because we have a lot to get through here. So part of your autonomic nervous system's job is survival, threat detection. So in order for you to survive, you need a system that's going to assess and scan your environment to detect threat. So your autonomic nervous system does this through a process called neuroception. And this is super fascinating. I think I might have mentioned this before on the podcast, but I think this is amazing. Your autonomic nervous system picks up on really minute cues in your environment. So if you're standing next to somebody on the subway, it is scanning that person, their body language, their tone of voice, micro expressions that they might be making, and it's determining whether or not that person is a threat to you. And all of this is happening below your conscious level of awareness. So your autonomic nervous system bypasses your rational brain, and in some cases even bypasses your conscious awareness to detect threat. And the reason for that is if you walked around a corner and there was a snake, and you had to rationally analyze the situation and say, okay, I'm 6 feet away from this thing. What species of snake is this? Is it really a threat? Do I need to do something about it? The rational thought process is too slow in some cases in order for you to react quickly enough to save your own life. So because of this, what the autonomic nervous system does is you'll walk around a corner and suddenly you'll jump 10 feet thinking you saw a snake, but it was really a hose. So, so it's not always going to get it right. But the thing is that you're still alive. Your autonomic system has worked. And so the fact that you jump 10 feet and it's just a hose, no harm done. But if you didn't jump 10 feet and it was a poisonous snake about to strike you, that's a real problem. So your autonomic nervous system is very reactive. It is not rational, and it is not within your conscious control. And this is really, really important to keep in mind when we talk about choking. So what does your autonomic system do when it detects a threat? So let's say there is a threat. What's going to happen is your autonomic system is going to activate the sympathetic nervous system. And imagine that sympathetic activation is on a continuum. So early on in the activation process, you're going to mobilize. You're going to mobilize resources, activate, get all systems go. This is your state of readiness. You're going to have, you might feel a little excited. You're going to feel a boost of energy. You're going to be very, very alert. And this is sort of that moment where your systems are ready to assess options for dealing with the threat. And this is where your autonomic system is determining, is fight better, flight better, or freeze. And this headspace, this kind of boost of energy and alertness, this is actually really, really great for performances, right? This is great for bike racing. This is great for a musical performance, for public speaking. That is actually kind of a good thing. But then you're going to move through this cycle, right? So now you're moving from a state of readiness into action. This is where your system is determined, okay, this is a lion. So our best option here is to run, because we're not gonna win a fight against a lion. So this is where you actually act. And so your body is going to now say, okay, we need to defeat the threat, fight. We need to escape the threat, flight. And this can also be good for performance, right? Like that little bit of adrenaline rush you get, some degree of this can actually be really beneficial. And we'll talk about that a little more in a second. But there's also a third option, which is the freeze option. And this is often ignored, and this is a really important one to understand. So freeze, let's imagine it's a lion and your body said, okay, flight, let's get out of here. And you start running, but the lion catches you and pins you down. What do you do now? You freeze. And this is what animals do in the wild when they play dead. And this is actually your parasympathetic system coming back online. That's a technical detail that you don't need to worry about. But freeze is the last resort. This is an involuntary response that is not within conscious control. So this is when animals play dead. And in the wild, this can actually mean that they endure less pain if they're going to get chewed on, or it might also mean that they die with less pain. But for humans, sometimes this can also be a psychological freeze response where you actually psychologically dissociate from a traumatic event it's a protective mechanism so that you don't experience the same degree of psychological pain that you might. This can also be physical, right? You might faint or pass out because it's too overwhelming. This is not good for performance. It's also it's very, very much related to trauma. And a lot of people who experience trauma really struggle with this because they get down on themselves for not having tried to run away or tried to fight. But the thing is, this is your autonomic nervous system. You don't get a say. It's not rational. You don't get to decide. Your autonomic system decides for you. And so if it decides to shut down and freeze, that's it. That's what's going to happen. So going back to that 2x4 example, when you're in training, your autonomic nervous system doesn't detect threat. When you're walking across that board on the ground, there's no threat. It's familiar. Maybe you've done it before. These are recognizable patterns. The stimuli are all familiar. Everything is predictable. It's within your control. So your autonomic nervous system goes, oh yeah, we've done this before and we're still alive. So this is probably fine. And you're going to stay in a rational, calm state. Let's say you show up to a bike race and now you have your 2x4 across the ravine with the crocodiles. Your autonomic nervous system is going to say, oh, this is unfamiliar. There's more uncertainty here. I feel more vulnerable. I have less control. Therefore, I'm detecting some threat, and your autonomic nervous system is going to activate that sympathetic state. So you're going to go into that mobilization. You're going to move maybe into fight or flight, and you might even move into freeze, depending on how sensitive your system is. And now you're going to have a lot of trouble accessing your rational thought processing, and you're going to have a lot of trouble accessing even like autopilot motions and actions that you're used to, like walking on a 2x4 suddenly becomes very difficult because your brain is awash in different chemicals, and now you're in this survival mode where you can't access those systems that you're used to accessing when you're just in training. The other thing to remember about this is your autonomic nervous system reaction. It may not always be rational, again, like it wasn't in that case, but that emotion and sensation is going to come first. And that's the immediate reaction. And then what's going to come after that is all of a sudden, now your conscious rational brain is going to become aware of the fact that there's all this tension in your body, and or maybe suddenly, you're standing next to a stranger and you just get this really bad vibe. Now suddenly your rational brain, because neuroception, remember that was happening below your level of conscious awareness, but now you have an autonomic response to some threat that your neuroception has detected unbeknownst to you, and you're going to feel it in your body. So now your rational brain comes online and says, oh, we're feeling a different way than we were a minute ago. What's going on? Your rational brain likes predictability and pattern, and it is going to find an explanation for what's going on. And it's not always going to get it right. So an example of this is if you're sitting in a parked car and the car next to you starts to move. What your brain is detecting is the relative movement, right? And for a split second, you're going to think the car is rolling, but it's not actually. Your rational brain is trying to slap on an explanation to what it's sensing, and it's not always going to get it right. So I'll give you another example of when I was riding with my David. We were riding along pretty social pace, and he started venting about something that had happened at work. It had nothing to do with me. There was nothing I could do to help. He was just venting for the sake of venting, as we do to our partners. And I started getting knots in my stomach, and I started feeling really tense, and I was like, whoa, what's going on? And in this moment, I was able to sort of think like, okay, my autonomic system is reacting to something here. What's going on? And my rational brain came in and was like, okay, let's think about this. He's not actually mad at me. There's nothing I can do to help this situation, but I'm responding, my whole body's responding as if he were directing his anger at me. And the only reason I was able to do this was because I was working with a therapist through some concussion stuff that was making me really aware of my autonomic system specifically. So I was able to say to David, hey, I know you're not mad at me right now, and I know you want to vent, and I really want to be here for you and listen to this so that you can vent, but for some reason, my autonomic system is just freaking out. So is it okay if we hit pause on this and talk about this some other time when my system's had a chance to calm down? Now,
when I'm not going through rock gardens and over roots and
But like if that had happened a year before I really understood what was going on in my autonomic system, what would have happened and has happened in the past is that reaction would happen. I would feel that tension and that kind of knot in my stomach, and my brain, instead of saying, oh, my autonomic system is responding to his tone of voice, which is not directed at me, I would have just felt that ickiness and then responded. My rational brain would say, okay, why am I feeling icky right now? Oh, David is making me feel icky. And then my brain is going to start reaching out for reasons that David might make me feel icky. And then all of a sudden my brain is on this track of like, what are some reasons I can think of to be frustrated with my partner? And boy, that leads down a totally different road, right? So what ends up happening is you have this autonomic response, and then your rational brain slaps on some narrative to explain it, and it's not always going to get it right. So how does this relate to bike racing? You show up to a bike race, it's a new, unfamiliar environment, it's kind of intimidating, your autonomic system floods you with a sense of tension, maybe you're sweating, you're getting clammy, maybe you feel a little bit shaky, and that autonomic response happens. So now your rational brain comes in and has to explain it. And your rational brain might make up a story like, oh yeah, well, you always choke at bike races, right? So your rational brain's trying to explain what this autonomic response is doing. And we come up with these stories that we tell ourselves that slowly over time become ingrained that might not actually be true. Yeah, Jonathan.
This is why I prefer solitude before a race. Like, because I can filter that out. Sorry, I'll just express myself freely here, but
Please
it drives
do,
me
yeah.
so nuts when I'm on the line and somebody starts talking to me. Like, I can't stand that. It drives me nuts because I'm trying to control my headspace and I'm absolutely vulnerable to something pulling me away from that. Now, over time, I've gotten to the point where I can have those things come in because Nate likes to chat before a race and likes to point out all the people that are going to beat him. He's like, this guy's super fast. He's here. This person's super fast. It's like one of the main things that Nate points out before a race. And I understand what he's doing. He's assessing his competition. But for me, it's like I've forced myself to get good at filtering all of that out. But that's a big thing that I see a lot of athletes do. They show up to a race and the first thing they start to focus on is everyone that's going to beat them. And I say it intentionally with those words because that's how it's framed, right? It's suddenly like, oh gosh, that person showed up. That person showed up. This is going to be really tough. I don't know how I'm going to be able to beat them. I can't beat them. They're way better at sprinting, or they're going to break away. They're going to be able to do this. If you put yourself in that situation before a race, you're just opening the door for yourself to have a negative, when we're talking about the autonomic nervous system, have a negative response to this, not one that's productive toward better performance. So
Right.
it's really tricky. And that's why that's the best part about dirt bikes. They're really loud and you have helmets on that cover everything and nobody talks to anybody. It's just so nice. And I kind of miss that. So don't talk to me before a race, please.
No, but this is a great point because you rock up to the race and suddenly there are all these things there that aren't there in training, right? There's an audience, competitors who might be talking to you when you don't feel like talking. There's a possibility of crashing. There's uncertain outcomes. So all of these things pose threats. And I say threats in quotes because these are perceived threats that your autonomic nervous system might pick up on. And this is why a race scenario is so different from training and why your autonomic state is so different at a race than it is in training because the stakes are higher.
Sorry, one more interruption. Oh, sorry, go ahead, Chad.
I was just going to say it sparks fear, right? It's fear or anxiety, but anxiety is a little more before the fact. But and this brings me to a point, and frankly, I mean, this is a very scientific discussion of this, and I just want to sit back and listen to it. But I will interject when I have little things of little moments of experience that I can relate from a coaching perspective. And this one is not necessarily tied to that, but I was watching Lady Dynamite the other night, and she said, and I knew this question was coming. She described fear as false evidence appearing real. And I had to think on that for a minute because, she's exactly right. And the evidence may or may not be false, but the potential outcomes are absolutely real. So when we look at what we're actually in fear of, we have the physical, which, injury, the psychological, shame, and the interpersonal, the loss of prestige, the loss of respect, the loss of all these competitors riding alongside us and the audience watching us. And all these things are actually real. So as succinct as her description was for something as complex as fear, you can't describe something so pithily. There's just so much more going on.
Well, and this is a great point. True. I see fans or just onlookers many times criticize athletes for being robotic in their interviews. And I then also see production companies interviewing a rider when they're on the line or right before they're about to go up to the running blocks or something like that. If you're going to interview an athlete in that moment, you're going to get a canned response because they have a canned process they are going through that they can replicate and control the fear like you're talking about here, Chad. So as a result, you're always going to get, and that's why it's so interesting that you'll see a NASCAR driver like Jimmy Johnson and then somebody like Usain Bolt. They'll both have the same type of response they would give to how do you think this race is going to unfold? It's going to sound really similar because they're both facing really similar circumstances, even though it's a totally different sport. And they're both facing their own challenges with that. So as a result, they'll kind of engineer around that. They'll have process, they'll stick to that. Probably, I guess, recapping that in a different way is probably the worst way to get an idea of who an athlete is to interview them when they're on the line or just about to perform, because then you'll just get an athlete's response. And that's just what it is when a person is trying to control that. So it's also, we shouldn't feel guilt, I feel like, or feel shame for feeling fear before a race, for
Exactly.
feeling apprehension or anything else like that, Amber, right? Like, because if we feel that, that probably only perpetuates the negative response that we would have.
Exactly. And we'll touch a little bit more on that in a little bit too, but that's exactly right, because everybody is going to feel more vulnerable and a higher level of uncertainty in a race scenario than you are in training, just by definition. That's just how it is. And your autonomic nervous system is going to interpret that increase in vulnerability, that increase in uncertainty, as threat. And so, I mean, it's just natural, right? When you choose to challenge yourself by showing up to a race, it requires courage because you're risking something. You have something on the line there, and it's something to be proud of, but it is a risk, right? And your physical system, your physiology is gonna interpret that, and it's going to respond. And I'll give you some more tools a little bit in how to work with that, but I still want to understand clarify how this process works, because I think that will really help when we talk about what you can do to avoid choking specifically. And Chad already touched on the fact that at a race, there's these additional threats, the physical, even the anticipation of suffering is a threat, right? Because how bad it's going to hurt when you really have to dig deep. And the anticipation of that's a threat, man. That's like a real legit threat. And then there's the fear of crashing, but then there's also those existential ones. And Chad already touched on a couple of those, but even identity, the risk of, will this undermine my identity, right? What meaning are you going to assign to the race outcome, and how is that going to affect your sense of self? Fear of failure. All of these things are very real kind of existential threats. And I want to drill down on that just for a second, because I think it's not, I want to clarify that this isn't just about ego in the sense of, and ego is a technical psychological term, but what I'm talking about here is kind of that foofy, more bro science-y term that, like the arrogance of really caring about what people think. Because I think some people might think like, oh, existential threat, like you shouldn't worry about what other people think. It's not a big deal. And if you're worried about what other people think, it just means that you're arrogant and you're self-absorbed. No, the threat to identity is very legitimate and very real. And for anybody who has sustained an injury where you couldn't participate in your sport, or like if you're an avid cyclist and you couldn't ride your bike, or you're a runner and you couldn't run, that temporary loss of identity can be physically painful. Like it's emotionally painful, but the pain of the emotion is so much that it can actually be physically painful. It's real. And that identity and that sense of self is legitimate. And so the existential threat, the threat to your identity that exists in a race scenario that doesn't exist in training, I just want to touch on that and say, hey, it's real, it's legit. And it doesn't mean that you're full of yourself or you're some self-centered jerk. It's just a very human thing that happens, right? Our identities are important. So that's a legitimate threat. And kind of dovetailing with this, I want to ask you a question. How did you treat yourself the last time you failed? Did you beat yourself up and maybe kick yourself while you were down? Not everybody does this, but a lot of us do. And I have definitely done this in the past, and it causes real emotional pain. It sucks because you're already disappointed in the outcome. And then you spend weeks, maybe months, just beating yourself up over it. And it is not fun. So what ends up happening when you beat yourself up for failures is your brain sees this sequence, and the sequence goes, bike race happens, failure happens, terrible pain happens. And now your brain is going to associate, therefore, bike race equals threat. So every time you go to a race and you have a disappointing outcome, and then you pile it on, you pile on the self-loathing and beating yourself up. And man, we can be unbelievably cruel to ourselves. And the point I want to make with this is it's not constructive, because you start to strengthen this negative association that your autonomic system is going to have with bike racing and with the uncertainty of the outcome at bike races. And it's within your power to nudge that association in a more positive or more negative direction. So beating yourself up, it causes a real negative association. Your autonomic nervous system, like I already said, it has a negativity bias. So let's say you had 10 really awesome bike races and 3 really terrible ones where you really beat yourself up. Guess which ones your autonomic nervous system is going to latch onto? Not the good ones. It's going to latch on all the ones. Exactly, because it's scanning for threat. So it already has this negativity bias. And then the other thing is your brain likes predictability. So it's going to search for narratives that reinforce or solidify your self-concept. So if you've already just, because of those 3 races, you've created this story in your head where, oh, I always cave under pressure, your brain is going to look for confirmation bias. It's going to look for evidence to support the narrative, even if it was only 3 bad races and then there were 10 really good ones. So I want to step back for a second and redefine choking. Choking is the result of normal, hardwired, and involuntary autonomic nervous system doing its job to protect you from a real or perceived threat. This is not a character flaw. This does not mean that you suck, okay? This is the normal, hardwired, involuntary functioning of the autonomic nervous system. And it's doing its job appropriately as it is meant to do to protect you from a real or perceived threat. Okay. And this doesn't happen within your conscious control. So for those of us who've experienced this before, it can be extremely distressing. And I'll share a quick story about that happened to me. So a couple years ago, I was in a big race and there was a really, really steep hill. And as we were going up the hill, I was just pinned. I was absolutely at my limit and a separation was happening. And I knew that I had to get across this gap. Otherwise, my race was over. Like, this was the crux moment of the race. So I absolutely drilled it and I got across. I got across the gap and I made it. I made the selection. I was there. I was in the front group. It was awesome. We crested the hill. So all that was ahead of me was a downhill. I had done the hard work. I had gone through the pain. I had suffered. I had made it. And I stopped pedaling. I stopped pedaling for like 2 seconds, which felt like an eternity. I lost contact with the group. And I ended up having to chase in no man's land for the rest of the race. And I spent weeks and months just raking myself over the coals for this moment. And I worked with my support psych and we kept going back to the same question. What were you saying to yourself in that moment? What made you decide to stop pedaling? And the thing I couldn't wrap my head around was I never decided. There was no inner talk. There was nothing rational happening. It was like my legs just decided to stop on their own and I had no control over it. And it wasn't until I was working with a therapist to heal from my concussion that I brought this story up to her and she said, that was neuroception. I said, what do you mean neuroception? And she said, well, at that point, how long had you been racing bikes? I said, 12 years. And she said, okay, how many times had you crashed by that time? I said, plenty. And she said, and how many crashes had you witnessed in that time? Well, a lot more than that. And she said, your autonomic nervous system and your brain is so finely tuned with that experience that it saw some dynamic, some pattern of movement in the peloton that signaled to you that a crash was about to happen. And your autonomic system got you out of there. And that's the thing. It's involuntary, it's irrational, it bypasses your whole rational system. So I didn't get a say in the matter. I didn't even know what was going on, but my autonomic system detected a threat and it got me out of there. And in that moment, when she explained that to me, it was literally like years of guilt. And I had been telling myself I was weak. I'd been telling myself I was a quitter. I'd been feeling so horrible about myself. And then all of a sudden to understand that, hey, actually, this is how my body works. And it means it was working appropriately. And it wasn't a matter of missing the selection. It was a matter of saving myself from a crash. My autonomic system worked the way it was supposed to.
Yeah. So this kind of goes to a point where you can't fight something that's so inherently like active and strong and just natural, right? Like you have to find a way to work with it. Probably a good transition point to start to talk about those very things about how we can actually use this or leverage this or build a favorable relationship with it. Right.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Because that's the thing is, okay, so we understand how this works now. And I'm telling you that this is all involuntary and hardwired. So you might be thinking, okay, well now I'm stuck with it. Like there's nothing I can do, but that's not true. You can work with your autonomic nervous system and not against it. And you can work with it in order to avoid choking. So the first thing is to accept that your autonomic nervous system, it's your friend. staying alive is a good thing. And if you're listening to this podcast, your ANS has been working well for you because you are still alive.
If you're listening, you didn't see that, but Nate just did the also Menno's hand over there. So I'm sure you're thinking of your accident that you recently had, right, Nate? Yeah. And he's muted again.
It's not always going to get it right, but understanding how it works and how it's meant to work is really, really powerful. Nate, are you back online?
Not really. I think he's having audio issues again.
Okay. So one of the good things, sorry, go ahead, Jonathan.
I was just going to say, let's dive into how to work with it versus against it. Yeah.
Okay. So the first thing is your autonomic nervous system and sympathetic activation are actually really great for getting into an optimal headspace for racing. Like I talked about before, in that ready state where you have a boost of energy, you're alert, you're ready to go. That's awesome. And the thing about sympathetic activation is it's kind of a three bears situation where not enough is bad for your performance, and then too much is also bad for your performance, but you want to find the just right. And what constitutes just right is really highly individual. And it really ties a lot in with emotions. And Chad, I think you had some thoughts on this too.
Yeah, because coming from the perspective of a coach, I've worked with enough riders to have encountered this enough times. I mean, I can relate to it as an athlete. I've been through this to varying degrees myself, but being approached with it and having someone kind of lay that at my feet and ask me, the person of authority, to help correct it has forced me to deal with this. And I won't say I wrote this down, here's how I approach this every time, but I did form a pattern of dealing with this. And the first of it started with recognition. So David, if I were coaching you, my first assignment to you would be recognizing what it is that you're fearful of, that you're anxious about, so that you can rationalize it and so that you can reframe it. Because when you recognize that both fear and anxiety stem from perceived threats, not necessarily real ones, it's tremendously empowering. You can start to recognize that they may not happen. They probably won't happen. In that case, this brings me to what would be your second assignment, where you turn that fear and that anxiety into arousal. And I think this is where Amber is going. And I hearken back to when Lee came out and taught us or coached us for a weekend, and he described this. He talked about this appropriate level of arousal. And what he was describing is the same thing that's described in Shane Murphy's The Sports Psych Handbook. And Shane's the editor. So in the chapter on anxiety, it was penned by Gloria Beleg, who was a psychologist, and she discusses the inverted U theory, which is also known as the Yerkes-Dodson law. Yerkes-Dodson law, probably seen that. But the idea being is that arousal climbs. So think of climbing up that inverted U, it peaks at an optimum and then it declines. But she goes on to observe, and I completely agree with her, that it's really more like a half hump, like a half of an inverted U that just dives off a cliff. Because it's not as though you're peaking towards that optimum arousal level, and then you go a little past it and you're not quite at optimum anymore. No, it's quite the contrary. It's just once you pass it, everything becomes terrifying in an instant. So it's like you drop off a cliff. And there's an issue with that too. Recognizing that I'm so close to that edge can be a little bit unnerving. And then as Amber just touched on, it's highly individual. Varies from athlete to athlete to athlete, but what she didn't mention is that it's also highly situational. You can be really comfortable with, say, going 30 miles per hour on a bike. 30 miles per hour on a mountain bike feels very different. 30 miles per hour on a steep descent on skis, very different. So you have to relate it to the situation too. It doesn't carry perfectly. So then my third assignment for you, David, and this is a term I used, is that you have to get into your head in order to get out of your head. You need to differentiate the possible from the likely. So you have to think about it so that you can stop thinking about it. And from that Sports Psych Handbook, the Beleg talks about playing, and then they were talking about golf, but obviously this carries across sport. So let's say racing, with the intention of avoiding mistakes, puts those mistakes right at the forefront of your attention. So, and what happens when you do that? Your muscle tension increases, your focus narrows, and typically on unproductive things, and your confidence tanks.
Yeah. It's like when you're riding a bike and there's an obstacle and you're like, I don't want to run into that thing. And then you're staring at the thing and
you
I don't want to run into it. And then you go straight for it.
Nate, in talking with you, I feel like a lot of this is probably resonating with mountain biking and your, I would say a steep learning curve that you've undertaken. I know that you feel like it probably hasn't been, but I feel like your improvement's been like you've taken your improvement on rather than letting your improvement just come to you. And as a result, I feel like it's been more rapid than others. But is this resonating with you at all? And like, do you have any thoughts on any of this so far?
I've got a ton of thoughts, but I want to let them finish because they got a whole bunch more stuff, and mine kind of layers on top of what's written already.
Okay, sounds good. Cool.
All right.
Carry on,
A couple
Amber.
people have mentioned I should turn up my volume, so I'm gonna talk closer to my mic, so hopefully that helps.
Well, one thing with that too, I'm going to point this out because we get this pretty commonly, but Zoom is actually, if you're joining us live right now, Zoom is auto leveling us. So it'll be quiet at the initial level. And then after that, it will stabilize. But the thing is, Amber has a softer voice in particular compared to Chad. So when Chad speaks versus Amber, or Nate in particular has probably the loudest one, it'll always seem a little bit quieter, but it's actually leveled. So, because if Amber went any closer to her microphone, we get like microphone to face noise. So she's doing what she can there. All right, continue.
All right. Okay. So choking, like letting your nerves get the best of you. And I say that's not a really good wording because as we know, you don't always have a choice in the matter. But choking usually means there's too much sympathetic activation. So what I would recommend for people who really struggle with that the counterpoint to that is that some people really need more activation. They don't have enough sympathetic activation. So it really depends on where you are. But David's question is specifically about choking, which usually is too much sympathetic activation. So a couple things you can do to tackle this. And it's sort of, and anyone who's listening, kind of think about it like this. Like if you feel like you don't get pumped up enough, think about things that are going to help pump you up. And if you get too pumped and your nerves can really undo you, then you want to kind of bring that sympathetic activation back down. So think of it as a dial and kind of imagine which direction that you need to turn the dial for your individual situation. But one of the things you can do for this is to build a race routine. And as we know, pattern and predictability reduce the perception of threat. So having a race routine in the first place already is going to bring down that level of threat that your autonomic nervous system is perceiving, because it's going to look at that and go, oh, this is my routine that I've done before and we didn't die, so this could be okay. And then if you are one of those people who needs to bring the activation level down a little bit, you can include elements in that routine that help dial back activation. So maybe some slow breathing exercises, maybe listening to calming music instead of pump up music. Those are things that could really help. Something that you could do not at the race would be to associate bike race stimuli with a calmer state of mind. So you can watch race videos when you're in a calm state or while you're listening to calming music. That's one way. Another way you can do it is to use visualization. You can just sit on your couch and close your eyes and imagine being at a bike race. Yeah, Jonathan.
One point to add to this too, forgive me, Amber, is even in your training, this could be a great opportunity if you're really terrified of criteriums, for example, watch our race analysis videos that we have when you're training, and then it's not that real race environment, but you get used to that. And it really does help. I find that it kind of like eases my transition. It puts training wheels on every year as I go into criteriums to have that experience of watching it, just because it's kind of crazy, getting
There's points in these races where it'll be a crash in front of me or someone like cuts off my wheel. And I have literally jumped watching it. And then the comments will be like, other people jump at the same time because they don't realize that, to Amber's point, the snake versus the hose, you're on a trainer and this is recorded, but you see that pattern happen and you like physically jump like you're going to swerve out of the way, which is kind of crazy.
Yeah,
exactly. So if you're sitting down, like whether it's watching a race or imagining one, you can actually feel your body shift. You can feel the sensations in your body change when that autonomic nervous system starts responding to what you're seeing. And you can actually stop and notice, okay, what's changing? Am I feeling tense? What are the specific fears that are arising? You can do things like visualize worst case outcomes and imagine yourself handling them really, really well. A good example of this was, I think, Michael Phelps at the Olympics one year in one of his events, one of the, million that he won. His goggles fell off. And so they filled up with water and he couldn't see. And he was in an interview afterwards and they were asking him about it. And they said, well, wasn't that really disconcerting? And he said, no, actually, I spent so much time visualizing everything that could go wrong. It felt like I was practicing handling worst case scenarios really well. So when it actually happened, he was very calm. He didn't react because he had trained his autonomic system to believe that that wasn't a threat.